Be Me 34 beekeeper, not the romantic kind you see in photos, with a flower meadow and a little wooden sign that says local honey, just a guy with 47 hives, 2 acres of land outside of town, and hands that smell like smoke. Most of the time, married 4 years, met her through mutual friends at a backyard thing. She was funny and direct, and I liked that. Immediately, she works HR at some mid-sized company. Downtown, her job is basically correcting how people behave at work, filing reports, mediating conflicts, sending emails with a lot of per our last conversation energy. She's good at it. She has this way of staying completely calm when someone is escalating at her, just waits them out. I respected that about her from the start, thought we were pretty well matched that way. Both of us on the quieter side, both of us comfortable with a slow kind of life. We weren't the couple that went out every weekend or had a packed social calendar, more the kind of people who stay in, cook something, argue mildly about what to watch, go to sleep. Fine life, not exciting by any metric, but genuinely fine. The property I have is about 20 minutes from town. Previous owner had a small orchard, mostly gone now, but a few of the apple trees are still there. I keep the hives along the tree line on the east side, where they get morning sun. The work is physical and slow and requires attention. You can't rush it and you can't fake it. Bees know the difference between someone who's paying attention and someone going through the motions. I learned that in my first season, and it stuck with me as a general philosophy about most things anyway. The first 2 years of marriage were good. We got into rhythms I'd be up before she was most days, out to the hives at first light. She'd make coffee, take her time getting ready, drive into town. Evenings I'd usually have something started for dinner. By the time she got back, she'd change, come sit at the kitchen table, talk about her day while I finished cooking. I'd talk about whatever had come up with the hives. If anything notable happened, she asked questions about the work. She was actually curious even though it wasn't her thing. Asked about why some colonies were more aggressive than others, about how you knew when a queen was failing, about the different honey varieties and what made them different. I liked that she asked. It made the work feel like it mattered to someone other than me. Things were solid. Then somewhere in year 3, the podcast started. I can't remember exactly when I first noticed. Think she mentioned something at dinner one evening, used a phrase I hadn't heard before. Something about emotional labor being unevenly distributed in heterosexual relationships. I asked what she was listening to. She said a podcast about feminism and relationships. Her friend had recommended it. I said, okay, didn't have a strong feeling either way. She could listen to whatever she wanted, but the vocabulary started changing gradually over the following weeks. Words like autonomy and invisible burden and relationship dynamics started appearing in regular conversation. I started noticing that the conversation was more often about what I wasn't doing than about anything that had actually happened. She'd come home, and instead of talking about her day, she'd open with something she'd heard on the commute about how men in relationships don't carry their share of the mental load, or about how women are conditioned to shrink themselves in partnerships. I'd listen, give my actual opinion if she asked, and mostly let it go. I wasn't going to start arguments about a podcast. But I noticed the shift. It was subtle. She wasn't suddenly a different person. But there was a background irritation that hadn't been there before. Like she was looking for evidence of something, checking to see if I matched a profile she'd been handed. Her friend had always been around, but became more present around this time. She works at a yoga studio, very certain about everything, talks in a way that makes you feel like you're already wrong before you open your mouth. Not malicious exactly, just relentlessly sure of herself and her read on things. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she found a framework that made sense of her own life and then assumed it was the one-size model. When they got together, the energy in the house would shift, not in a way I could name, precisely just in a way where I felt slightly like a subject being discussed rather than a person in the room. I'd usually find something to do, elsewhere workshop, porch, walk the property line. Not because anyone asked me to leave, just because the air was different and I didn't want to be in it. One evening I came in from the east side, jacket still on, smoker on the porch. She and her friend were at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine. Open they went quiet when I walked in. Not a guilty quiet, more the kind of quiet that happens when a conversation has been going on for a while, and a third party arrives. I got a glass of water, said, hey to the friend, said, hey to my wife, went to the other room to read, heard talking resume behind me, lower than before. At some point, I caught the friend's voice saying something like, you deserve to know who you are outside of this. I didn't hear my wife's response. I didn't try to went to bed before the friend left. That was probably about a month before the announcement. I call it the announcement, because that's really what it was. She sat me down one afternoon, same spot at the kitchen table where we've had every significant conversation since we moved in. Hands folded, posture straight, said she'd been thinking for a while, and she needed to take a solo trip, not a vacation. She was clear on the distinction. A solo trip 2 weeks somewhere in the mountains, hostels, no fixed plan. She needed to prove to herself she could exist outside of the relationship on her own terms. She needed space to figure out who she was. As an individual, I took in what she said, asked if something was wrong between us. She said no, this wasn't about me. It was about her, about rediscovering who she was, outside of the structure we'd built together. I thought about it for maybe 3 seconds, said okay. Asked if she wanted a ride to the station, or if she was taking the car. She stared at me, genuinely looked like I'd answered in a language she didn't expect. Asked if that was really my whole reaction. I said I wasn't sure what other reaction she was looking for. She wanted to be independent. I wasn't opposed to that. So she should go. She said she expected me to push back at least a little. I said I wasn't going to argue against her doing something. She said she said something about how the whole point was partly to see how I'd respond. I said that's not the same thing as a reason to go. She didn't have a response to that right away. I could see her recalibrating something internally. Then she said, fine, said she'd leave at the end of the week. I said that was fine. The week before she left had a slightly charged atmosphere, but nothing dramatic. She was packing, researching trail routes, reading hostel reviews. I was in the middle of a stretch of mid-season inspections on most of the colonies. We were mostly in the same house doing different things. Couple of normal dinners, normal evenings. One of those evenings she was on her laptop researching the route trail conditions, hostel ratings, what gear she'd need. I was reading at the table nearby. At some point she looked up and said something like, "Aren't you even a little worried?" I asked what she meant. She said about her going alone, staying in hostels, not having a plan. I said I trusted her to handle herself. She looked at me for a second like she was trying to figure out if that was a compliment or not, then went back to the laptop. She mentioned once that her friend was thrilled about the plan, said it was exactly what she needed to do. I said I hoped it would be good for her, meant it genuinely. The morning she left, I was already out at the hives. By the time she was loading the car, she came out to the fence line, one bag already in the back seat, called my name. I pulled off the veil and walked over. She looked at me like she was waiting for something to happen, a speech maybe, or some kind of expression. She'd been anticipating. I told her to drive safe and send a message when she got there. She said okay, got in the car, backed down the driveway and turned toward the road. I watched the car until it turned at the bend, put the veil back on, and walked back to the hive. I'd been working. There was a colony in the 3rd row that had been behaving unusually for about a week. Population seemed fine from the outside. Activity at the entrance was normal, but something felt off in the way. You notice things after you've been doing the work long enough. I spent a good 2 hours going through it. Frame by frame found the issue. Eventually Queen was present, but her laying pattern had become irregular, spotty in a way that suggested she was declining. Marked the hive, made notes, decided to give it another week before deciding whether to re-queen. By the time I came in and made coffee, she'd been gone for 3 hours. Scrambled some eggs, read through my notes from the morning, made a list for the supply store, completely normal day. She texted around 4 in the afternoon, said she'd arrived. Hostel was small but clean. Mountains were exactly what she'd hoped, sent a photo of the view from her room window. It was a nice photo, the kind of mountains that look like someone arranged them. I wrote back, "Good, glad you made it safe. View looks worth the drive." She said, "Thanks, that was it." For the evening next morning, same routine. Up before light, coffee, out to the hives. The neighbor from the far property came by to return a frame tool he'd borrowed a few weeks earlier. We ended up talking for the better part of an hour. He'd been having trouble with robbing behavior in a couple of his weaker colonies, smaller hives being raided by the stronger ones. For their stores, we talked through the options, reduced entrances, relocating the hive, timing adjustments. He stayed for coffee afterward. We sat on the porch and talked about the season, how the nectar flow had been running, what the yield was starting to look like. Both of us thought it was going to be a strong harvest if the weather held one of those mornings that just works out without any effort. My wife sent a photo around midday, a trail she'd done, fog still sitting in the valley below the ridge, wrote something like, "I already feel different out here." I looked at the photo, wrote back, "Looks like good hiking weather." She sent a thumbs up. I put the phone down and went back to what I was doing. I want to be clear about something here, because I can see where it looks like I'm being deliberately cold. I didn't know what I was supposed to be writing to her. She had told me the trip was for her independence and her sense of self. The version of me who texts her 14 times a day, asking when she's coming home, is not respecting that. So I wasn't doing that. I was taking her at her word. Whether she actually meant the words she used is a different question. Days were full, regardless. The supply store run took most of one morning. A colony I'd been watching for swarm preparation needed attending, found a queen cell, made the call to do a split setup. A nuke with the frame and a decent population of nurse bees gave them a chance to raise their own queen from the cell. That's a whole process that takes attention and follow-through. Over days had dinner one evening at my neighbor's place. His wife made a big pot of something. We sat around the table and talked about normal things. Land prices going up in the area, their son who'd recently moved for work, whether the dry stretch was going to affect the late summer flow, drove home around 10. The dog that had been showing up for a few weeks came around when I pulled in. I gave it some food and left the porch light on, went to sleep in the morning. I found it asleep on the porch mat. I stepped over it, made coffee, went to the hives. It was still there when I got back, starting to feel like a decision was being made for me. She texted that night, but I was already out. Saw it in the morning. She said she'd met some interesting people at the hostel, a couple doing a long cross-country route. A woman who'd been traveling solo for a month. Said it was strange and a good way to talk to people with no shared context. I wrote back, sounds like a good crowd to fall in with that. Morning, I had a delivery to prep 2 cases of the spring blend for the restaurant in town. The chef there had been buying from me for a couple of years. Uses the honey in a house, dressing, and a dessert on the current menu. Professional relationship that had gradually become something loosely like friendship he'd sometimes call when he had product approaching its window. Drop it by the property good arrangement. I loaded the cases into the truck, drove in, dropped them off, stayed for a coffee at the bar while the place was still quiet before service drove back. She called that afternoon, probably day 6 counting from when she left. I picked up on the second ring, had my jacket half off from coming inside. Voice sounded a little flat compared to the earlier texts, asked how I was doing. I said fine, asked how she was. She said good, tired from a hike. We talked about nothing in particular for a minute. Then she said, kinda just dropped it into the conversation, that she had expected me to reach out more. I said I hadn't wanted to interrupt her trip. She said I wouldn't have been interrupting. I said okay, I could text more, if that's what she wanted. She said she didn't want me to do it, because she'd asked. I sat with that sentence for a second. I understood what she meant. I think she wanted the contact to be coming from something natural in me, not because she'd requested it. But here's the problem with that. For me, it was completely natural to leave her alone. That was my actual response to someone who said they needed space and independence. I wasn't playing a game. I didn't know the correct move was to ignore what she said and text constantly. Anyway, I said I wasn't sure how to work around that. Logic asked what she actually needed from me right now. Whatever it was, I'd try to do it. She said she didn't know. I said, let me know when you figure it out, and I'll do my best. She said, okay. We talked for a few more minutes. She asked if the dog had come back. I said, yeah, showed up again. I'd given it food. She said, good. She always had more feelings about that dog than she let on directly. We said goodnight. I made dinner and thought about the call while the pan was heating. Something was off, but I still couldn't locate it exactly. It felt like she was testing the temperature of something and not finding what she expected. I didn't know what the expected reading was supposed to be, so I had no way to help day 8 or so. She sent a longer message than any of the previous ones, said she'd been thinking a lot on this trip and starting to wonder if she was running away from something or towards something, and she wasn't sure what that meant. For when she got back, I read it a couple of times, wrote that I thought that kind of question was worth sitting with. No rush to land on an answer. She said that was very me. I took it as a neutral observation rather than a criticism. Then she said, sometimes she wished I would just react to things I asked. What she meant by react, she said, like, show a feeling, be bothered by something, let something land visibly. I thought about how to respond to that. Wrote that I had feelings, I just didn't tend to put them in the text messages while she was on a trip that was supposed to be about her. And also that I didn't think her going somewhere, she said she needed to go, was something I should be upset about. She said that was the problem. I said I wasn't sure I followed. She said she went on the trip partly to see what I would do. I put the phone down on the table for a second, looked at the wall, picked it back up, wrote, "And what did you find out?" She didn't respond for a while when she did. She just said she wasn't sure. Yet I said, okay, went to sleep. Day 9 was a big day. Had been planning a major extraction run for a while, and the timing had lined up. Neighbor came over with his extractor to run alongside mine. We set up in the barn, started pulling frames at mid-morning, uncapped. Got both machines running. It's loud when 2 extractors are going. It's also incredibly good smelling, in a way that's hard to describe. If you haven't been in a room full of fresh honey, there's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching the honey gate open and the product flow into the collection tank, especially when the color is right and the consistency is clean. This was one of the best runs I'd had, everything lined up. We filled over 80 jars by early evening, good amber, strong smell, the kind of product that photographs well and tastes exactly like. It looks neighbor stayed for dinner. We were both tired in the good way that comes from physical work that goes well made. Pasta, opened a couple of beers, talked about next week, about the market schedule, about whether the late flow would support another extraction before the season closed. He left around 9. I cleaned up, labeled a first batch of jars, lined them up on the kitchen shelf. They caught the light from the overhead in a way that looked genuinely satisfying, took a photo. Sent it to the restaurant contact with a note about availability. She texted that night, said she was having trouble sleeping. I said, hostel beds could be rough on you. She said it wasn't the bed. I asked what was on her mind. She said she kept thinking about home, which surprised her because the whole point of the trip was to not think about home. I said that sometimes being away helped you figure out what you actually wanted to come back to. She said, maybe then she said something. I've thought about a few times since. Said she thought independence was supposed to feel like expansion, but mostly it felt like absence. I read that carefully, wrote back, maybe those aren't actually different things, and you're just feeling both sides of it. At the same time, she said maybe said goodnight. I went to bed thinking she'd probably come home before the 2 weeks were up. Not because she was miserable there, exactly more, because I think she had done what she came to do and wasn't sure what the second week was supposed to add. Day 10 she called, midday. I was in the middle of something, but picked up. She said directly, right at the start, do you want me to come home? I said, of course I do. She said, then why don't you act like it? I said, I was acting like someone who respected what she told me she needed. She said sometimes respecting someone's words means seeing past the words to what's underneath. I thought about that for a second, said, I wasn't going to perform, worry for her benefit. That would be putting on a show. She said that was infuriating. I said, I understood that. She said, did I really? I said, I thought I did. She went quiet, then said she was thinking about coming back early. I said if she wanted to come back, she should come back. Whenever felt right was fine. She said stop doing that. I asked what I was doing. She said, being completely reasonable all the time. I actually laughed a little at that. Said I didn't know how to apologize for being reasonable. She was quiet again. Then she laughed a little too. Reluctantly, the way you laugh when something is funny and you don't want to give the other person the point. Said this wasn't going how she planned. I asked what the plan was. She said she wasn't going to tell me. I said that was fair. She said she'd let me know about timing. I said okay, I'd have dinner ready whenever she got back. She said okay. We hung up. I went back to what I was doing. Wasn't worried about the call. Something had shifted in it, and I thought it was moving in a reasonable direction. Day 12, she texted early in the morning, said she was coming home in 2 days. I said, great, let me know your arrival time. She sent the time in the afternoon. I said I'd be home. Spent those 2 days finishing the extraction, cleanup, rinsing equipment, storing the extractor, doing the accounting on jars, pricing the secondary batch for the farmers. Market table, neighbor came by again with a question about one of his weaker hives going into the end of season. We walked the hive together. I gave him my read on the store's situation. Normal couple of mornings on the day she was coming back, I made sure to be done with the hives before noon, cleaned up properly, got changed, started thinking about dinner, decided to keep it simple. Something I knew she liked, also cleaned the house properly. Not because I'd let it go, just because it seemed like the right thing to have done by the time she walked in, wiped everything down, changed the sheets, put fresh towels out. The kind of thing you notice when it's done and don't notice when it isn't. She pulled into the driveway just after 4 in the afternoon. I heard the car and came out to the front of the house. She had one bag. Looked tired in a way that wasn't about the drive, the kind of tired that comes from thinking too hard for too long. I took the bag from her, asked how the drive was. She said long. I said those mountain roads do that. We went inside. She stopped in the kitchen doorway for a second and looked at the jars lined up on the shelf. I had arranged the good ones from the harvest. Maybe 30 jars in 2 rows. The light was good at that time of day. They were catching it. She stood there just looking at them for a moment. I asked if she was hungry. She said not really, asked if she wanted tea. She said yes. I put the kettle on. She sat down at the table. I brought the cups over when it was ready. Sat across from her. Asked how it was. Overall, she said it was a lot to process. I waited. She said it wasn't what she expected. I asked what she expected. She said she thought she'd feel more certain about things by the end of 2 weeks, more clear on things. Instead, she'd spent most of it arguing with herself. I said sometimes trips are like that. The clarity comes later. She held her cup, said her friend had texted her multiple times over the whole 2 weeks checking in, telling her she was brave, that this was so important. Said at a certain point the cheerleading started feeling exhausting, like the support was more for the idea of what she was doing than for her actually doing it. I said sometimes encouragement can feel like pressure with nicer packaging. She looked at me, said, yeah, exactly like that. She said her friend had a way of making her feel like she needed to be having a breakthrough at all times. Like any moment that wasn't revelatory was a failure to lean in properly. I didn't say anything to that. She said she'd had one long conversation with the woman traveling solo. The one who'd been on the road for a month said that woman seemed genuinely happy, but also genuinely alone in a way that wasn't romantic or inspiring, up close, just alone, and she couldn't work out if that was freedom or loneliness or just the same condition. With different framing, I said probably all 3 depending on the day and the hour. She was quiet for a minute, then said something I wasn't expecting, said somewhere around day 8. She had convinced herself that my calmness was a form of toxicity, that she'd been hearing a lot of content framing male emotional steadiness as either checked out behavior or a manipulation tactic, like if he's not reacting visibly, then he's either given up or he's running a game. She said she caught herself applying that to me and then felt foolish about it. I said it wasn't foolish exactly. If you listen to a framework long enough, it starts applying itself automatically to everything you look at. She said, right, said. She kept trying to categorize me and I wouldn't fit anywhere. She was given, I said I was just at work. She actually smiled at that. A real one, not the polite kind, said. She knew, said somehow that was more disorienting than if I'd been obviously miserable waiting for her. We sat for a while after that. Not uncomfortable, just 2 people who had been in different places for nearly 2 weeks, sitting in the same room. Again, she went to shower. I started making dinner. She came back looking more herself, hair still damp. In her actual home clothes, we ate at the table and talked about practical things, whether the farmer's market was worth doing next month, the car's oil change, the dog that kept showing up. She said we should just officially get food for the dog and commit to it. I said we'd basically already been doing that for a month. She said then we should just admit we have a dog. I said fair enough, we have a dog. Apparently she went to bed earlier than usual. I cleaned up, went out to the porch for a while, clear night. Warm enough to sit without a jacket. The hives were quiet the way they get after dark. That low hum you can barely hear if you know to listen for it. I thought about the 2 weeks not with anger or satisfaction or any strong feeling, just turned it over. The way you turn over a frame to look at both sides. She had gone to find herself, and found a lot of questions instead of answers, and found that I wasn't the thing she'd been told I probably was. I didn't know yet if that was good or complicated for us, thought it was probably both. At the same time, went inside, went to bed. The following days were adjustment, nothing dramatic, just recalibration. She went back to work, I went back to the hives. She was quieter than usual in the evenings, but not a withdrawn quiet. More like someone who has a lot running in the background while they do regular things. Her friend called a couple of times during that period. I noticed the calls were shorter than they used to be. My wife would give brief answers and wrap it up without the long kitchen conversations that used to follow. One evening she mentioned that her friend had told her she'd sabotage the trip by coming home early, that she'd let herself get pulled back in. I was washing a jar at the sink when she said it, asked what she said back. She said she told her that wasn't what happened, that nothing had pulled her back in, she'd just been done. Friend had something to say about that, about patterns and comfort and not recognizing the cage my wife said she'd left it there. Then she said she'd been thinking about how much of the past year had been her listening to voices that weren't hers, taking their read on her situation and applying it to her actual life like it was a match. I put the jar down, said, "I thought that was a clear-headed thing to notice," she said. It cost her an expensive trip to notice it. So maybe not that clear-headed. I said sometimes that's just the price. She said yeah. I asked if she'd still recommend the mountains. She said yes, but for the hiking, not for the self-discovery. I said that's usually how it goes. Anyway, she said, probably things kept settling after that. The sharp edges of it softened the way most things do. Over time, she stopped bringing up the trip. As a topic, stopped bringing up the framework. Stuff started just being in the evenings. The way she used to be asking about the hives, telling me about work, arguing about what to watch. She told me one evening about a situation at work. One of the managers she'd been mediating around for months had finally crossed a line that was documentable. She had to write up the report, spent the story getting more animated as she went. I told her she'd been right about him from the start. She said she knew, said sometimes you have to wait for people to show you what they are. I said that was true of most things. She said, yeah, gave me a look. I couldn't fully read, didn't say anything else about it. I didn't push her. Friend came by once, maybe 3 weeks after she got back. They were on the back porch with wine. I was in the workshop doing maintenance on the extractor, came through for a drink at some point and caught the tail end of something. Friend saying, my wife had just gone back to normal, like nothing happened. My wife said that was because nothing happened in the way she was implying. Friend said something about patterns and comfort zones and not seeing them clearly when you're inside them. My wife said something I didn't fully catch, but the tone was direct, not unkind, just direct in a way that signaled she was done with the direction of the conversation. The friend left not long after my wife came inside, got some water, stood in the kitchen for a second, said she thought she'd outgrown some things while she was away. I said that could be a good thing. She said she thought so. Too few days after that, she came out to the hives for the first time in a while, just stood at the fence and watched me work a row. I finished and walked over. She said she liked watching that. It looked like I knew exactly what I was doing. I said most of the time. She said that must be a nice feeling. I said it was. She looked at the hives for a while, then said she was sorry, not in a big way, not making a production of it, just said she was sorry for building a version of me in her head, based on a template she'd been given, and then feeling frustrated when I didn't match something I hadn't been consulted about. I said she didn't need to apologize for that. She said she did a little. She said the podcasts had been filling in blanks with a particular set of answers, and she'd been listening to them long enough that she stopped checking those answers against her actual experience. I said, that's an easy thing to let happen. It's comfortable to have a framework that organizes the confusion for you. She said, but at some point it started picking fights that weren't there, seeing patterns in things that were just me being me. I nodded. She said she was done with those particular ones. Not with the broader ideas necessarily, just with that specific source. I said that seemed reasonable. She said I didn't have to be diplomatic about it. I said I wasn't being diplomatic. I genuinely didn't think all the ideas were wrong, just that they'd been applied badly to a situation that didn't fit the template. She looked at me for a second, said, okay. She went back inside. I went back to the hives. The season ended strong, best harvest in 3 years. By a clear margin, the restaurant doubled their standing order for the following year. I added 2 new colonies over winter from the split that had worked out. Well, things kept going, things kept being fine. She's still at the same job, still comes home with stories about correcting people's behavior and navigating whatever the current drama is. I'm still at the same hives, still coming home smelling like smoke. The dog is official, now has a name, has a bowl, has a spot on the couch that my wife pretends not to see. Her friend is still around, but different. Not as present, not as loud. When she is, the podcasts are probably still on her phone somewhere. I don't ask, not my business, what she listens to. I think about the trip sometimes when I'm working a row in the mornings, not with any strong feeling attached, more like an interesting stretch of time to look back at. She left to find herself, and found mostly that she didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She came back and the house was clean. The honey was jarred. The dog had been fed. I hadn't been sitting in the dark waiting for her. I had just been here doing the work. That's really what the whole thing came down to when I strip everything else away. Not any grand statement about independence or feminist frameworks, or who needs who. Just the fact that I was already okay, had been okay the whole time, didn't need her absence to discover that already knew it. She needed the trip to work out what she needed, and part of what she found out was that she'd been handed a map to a place that didn't quite match the territory she was actually in. I'm not going to editorialize too much about what that means in the bigger picture. I'll just say the hives are full. Heading into next season, found a good spot for 2 new colonies on the west edge, where there's more clover cover. Spent a morning prepping the ground, getting the stands leveled. Good work, the kind that pays off quietly. Over time, the dog has decided the porch is hers at specific hours and will stare at me if I try to sit in the wrong chair. My wife bought it, a proper bed, put it inside near the back door. Dog sleeps there most nights. Now my wife came out last week to watch the evening inspection, stayed for the whole thing this time. Not just a few minutes at the fence, asked questions, remembered details from months ago, when I'd explained something about queen behavior on the walk back to the house. She said she thought she understood why. I liked the work. I asked what she thought. The reason was, she said, because it rewards you for paying attention. I said, yeah, that's most of it. She said that was rare. I said it was. We stood there for a minute in the evening. The light was going sideways through the apple trees. The hives were making that low sound they make when everything is in order. She said something I didn't catch at first. I asked her to repeat it. She said she was glad she went. I said good. She said, but not for the reason she thought she was going for. I said, yeah. Those trips usually work like that. She looked at me, said, did you know that? Before I left, I said, I had a feeling she asked why I didn't say anything. I said because you had to go find out yourself. She was quiet for a second, then said that was either very wise or very annoying. I said, probably both. Depending on the day, she shook her head, not upset. Just the gesture people make when they don't have a comeback. We walked back to the house together. I made tea. She sat at the table with her feet up on the opposite chair, the way she does when she's properly relaxed. We didn't talk about the trip again that night, talked about the farmer's market coming up, and whether it was worth the early start. She said she'd come with me this time. If I wanted, I said, that'd be good. Extra pair of hands, helps with the table. She said she'd drive so I could sleep on the way. I said she'd have to be up before 4. Then she said she knew, said it wasn't a problem. I said, all right then, that was it, MFW. I gave my wife 2 weeks of independence, and she came home to find out I hadn't spent any of it suffering, just working, eating, sleeping, waking up, working again, steady the way I've always been. Steady, she asked me once, not long after she got back. If I ever got lonely out there in the mornings, I thought about it. Honestly said, not really, the work kept you company in a way that was hard to explain. She said she believed me, said she thought she understood it a little better. Now she's still figuring out what she thinks about all of it. I think she's getting there. We both are, probably the hives. Don't wait for anyone to finish deciding, so I don't either. You just get up, check the frames, note what you see, and go from there every morning, the same, every season a little different. That's all it ever is. You just get up and work. That's the whole thing, really.